Hello, everyone. I see still some people coming in. Welcome. Take a seat. There are also some empty seats here in the front. If you're looking for a chair, this is a nice one. Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Els Aerts, and I am a program curator for Studium Generale, the platform for knowledge and reflection of Utrecht University. A warm welcome to everyone that is sitting here in the aula of the Academiegebouw, and also a warm welcome to the people that couldn't make it and are watching the live stream from home. Hello. This is the first evening in our series Beyond Capitalism, in which we discuss alternatives to the capitalist system. The old idea that economic growth and more wealth and more consumption is needed to keep our society thriving seems not to hold anymore when we are stretching or crossing the planetary boundaries, when wealth distribution inequalities are even becoming bigger instead of smaller. But what are the alternatives, and how will we get there? This evening is a co-production with the platform Visions for the Future that aims to analyze and compare different proposals for alternatives to capitalism in our society. So thanks a lot for your help with making this program. First, I will talk you through what we're going to do tonight. We invited two guests. The first one will give a talk of about 45 minutes, and then he will be followed up by our other guest, who will give a reflection on his story of approximately 10 minutes, and then you can ask questions, the audience. And also the people that are watching online, you may also ask questions in the chat, and my colleague will send them to my phone, so I will feel free to also ask things to our speakers. One other thing I wanted to say, this is an event by Studium Generale. I just wanted to give a little attention to our festival, Bedweter Festival. It's this Friday, and it's an evening full of scientific talks, music, theater, art. You can become a person in live scientific experiments, so it's great fun. We still have some tickets left, so if you're interested and if you like this evening, you can still buy a ticket. And then I will introduce the first speaker to you. He is a very special guest to us, who came all the way from the United Kingdom. He is an ecological economist. Took me some time to practice that, at the University of Surrey, where he's the director of the Center for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. He wrote a well-known book. It's called Prosperity Without Growth, and his latest work was published last April and is called The Care Economy. In addition, also nice to know, he writes dramatic pieces and plays. He even wrote a 30-episode environmental thriller series for the radio, so I would say we also need more of that. We are very, very honored to have him here on our stage. Please give a warm applause to Tim Jackson.
Yeah, thank you, Els. Thank you to Visions for the Future. Thank you particularly to Ingrid and to Catarina, who's going to comment on my whatever nonsense comes out of my mouth in the next 40 minutes or so. I spent my afternoon listening to President Trump talking to the United Nations, so I'm going to take a little bit out of his playbook and insult you all, first of all, and then tell you how I am the greatest, and then tell you how climate change is a hoax, and after that we can have some questions. No, I'm not going to do that. It actually depressed the hell out of me, I have to say, to listen to a statesman, supposedly of the greatest country in the world, relinquishing every skill of statesmanship and every aspect of diplomacy and every sense of decency. And it makes you wonder Els mentioned that my latest book is called The Care Economy. It makes you wonder why anyone would bother to write about care in a world in which care had so patently gone missing. But it's also true, and I think I sort of take this as my motivation, that it is in such a world that these kinds of conversations are more vital than ever, that they are places where actually we can, to some extent, defend ourselves and defend public discourse against a form of statesmanship that is creating havoc. So, it's in that spirit, I guess, that I want to talk to you today, rather than in the spirit of thinking that my ideas, or any of our ideas, are going to fall tomorrow into the hands of government and be enacted so that we save ourselves from all the situations that we've given rise to. And it's in that vein that this question is a particularly interesting question. It's been posed to me, actually. I was given my title, Can There Be Prosperity Without Growth? And if you were thinking about it from a purely philosophical point of view, you could ask yourself the question, well, can there be prosperity with growth? Have we had that prosperity, even with the kind of growth that we've had? And then you could ask the question, is it possible to have growth? What kind of growth is it possible to have? All of those are very interesting questions, and they lead, I think, to perhaps the most interesting conversation of our time. What do we want from our society in the world? What do we want our society to be? What is prosperity? In its roots, the word prosperity means prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and expectations, our aspirations, if you like, for the good life. It's been cashed out in our modern economies to be broadly about income and wealth, and about increasing income and wealth. If we increase our income and wealth, then our prosperity will increase. That's the story, at least. Now, you will expect me, maybe with a title like that, to be critical of that story, and I am. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are some elements of truth within that story, that I'm not here to tell you that income doesn't matter. I'm not here to tell you that the economy doesn't matter. I'm going to give you, actually, some economic statistics. Apologies for that in advance for those who don't like economics, who hated it at school like I did. And in some ways, I want to recover economics. I want economics to be something that we reclaim for ourselves as the place where we think about how to deliver prosperity. But we do that without this fixed assumption that we're doing it on the back of something called economic growth, which very few people understand, which politicians constantly chase after, and which economists tell us in the language that we don't understand exactly what it means and how it works. That seems to be a recipe for disaster for a conversation that is absolutely vital about what kind of world we want. And I think it's part of the talk, I suppose, is to encourage us as a society out of the dogma of something like economic growth, out of that dogma that capitalism has become in terms of its organization of society, in terms of its narrative about what the good life is, and in terms of the values that it promotes, values that came to the fore in that conversation that Trump had with the UN. As opposed to the values that many ordinary people feel and hold dear for themselves. That's all, to me, a part of that conversation, and it's a part of what economics should be doing. So, just to perhaps declare my interests, and Els mentioned this, I wrote something called Prosperity Without Growth, which is kind of why the title has been sort of selected for me and why it's relevant to my work. And that was a piece of work for the UK government, actually. It was a report written to the Prime Minister of the UK government at the time that it was written in 2009. And I could honestly say it changed my life. I mean, it stopped me writing plays for quite a long time, for example. Although, interestingly, that 30-part thriller that you mentioned is about to reappear on BBC Sounds, for anyone who's interested, from December this year, 27 years after I wrote it. So we shall see whether it stands the test of time. But my life as a playwright actually more or less stopped when Prosperity Without Growth was published, because it became so all-consuming as a piece of output, as a piece of my work. This document translated into over 20 languages. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a book called, I'm not going to attempt the pronunciation, I want someone to do it for me, welvaart zonder groei. Say it for me? Groei. Welvaart zonder groei. Okay, thank you. So it was one of many translations, to be honest, I mean, my point is, it was a very humbling experience for an academic. Yes, I happened to be working in an advisory capacity for the UK government, but I broadly saw my life, apart from playwriting, in terms of writing academic papers, and all of a sudden, this one report, which I wrote for the Sustainable Development Commission, took me places and opened conversations that not only changed my life, but left me many times thankful for that piece of work because of the people that it brought me to and the conversations it brought me to as well. And that's one of the reasons why I love doing this kind of event and look forward to your questions about it. But how realistic is it, this idea that you can have prosperity without growth? That's what I want to kind of get to. And what might it look like if we could? But first of all, and the first bit of the talk really is a kind of diagnosis of why you might ask that question and where we are in relation to this growth-based economy. And it's a really interesting story. The most obvious starting place is something like this. It's so simple that your kids could get it, infants can get it. You can talk to kids in a primary school and you can say, look, we're living on a finite planet. How big can the economy get? And they will understand that endless economic growth into finite planet doesn't go. Now, if you're an economist, you will turn around and say it's not as simple as that, because what we can do, what we're talking about is the growth of the monetary economy, not the growth of the material economy. So we can decouple growth from its material impacts, and we can grow money forever and yet stay within our planetary boundaries. Nobody's ever done it. Nobody's ever seen it done. Nobody's ever really articulated what it might look like. There's lots of wonderful attempts to say, yes, we'll have growth, but it'll be good growth. It'll be smart growth. It'll be sustainable growth. It'll be green growth. It'll be radical growth, I understand, is the latest from the VVD. It'll be something different. It'll be the right kind of growth. And this right kind of growth will save us from this obvious dilemma that as you expand the economy, you come up against the planetary boundaries. You come up against the limits of the finite planet that we live on. And we undermine those limits, we transgress those limits at our peril, because that is the basis for any kind of economy, let alone any kind of growth into the future. Our kids' future depends on not trashing that one planet that we've got. Now, I could go into a wonderful diversion here about Elon Musk and Mars One and the idea that we can terraform the red planet to create a whole nother Earth. But I want to stay somewhat within the bounds of realism, so I'm not quite going to go there just yet. Although it is an interesting departure, something that wasn't quite on the table when Prosperity Without Growth was written, and something that as a university teacher, I suddenly had to come up against because I had students in my classes, one of whom had actually signed up for Mars One, this mission to Mars that was going to, change the one planet we had to a two planet, which was going to make everything half as easy, of course, if only we could figure out how to do it. So given the uncomfortable reality of just one planet, the most obvious argument against continuous economic growth is an ecological one. And, I'm using climate change as an example in defiance of Donald Trump's declaration that climate change is a hoax, because most of the science that we have suggests that climate change is not only real, but we are rapidly transgressing certain kinds of planetary boundaries, and that the state of our climate actually this year may, for the first time, exceed that 1.5 boundary that was set down in the Paris meeting in 2015, that governments around the world signed up to commit to try to reach a target of no more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average temperature. And this year we may actually find that we have transgressed that. We don't know yet for sure from the final statistics. What we do know is that there is not a lot of space left to meet that Paris target, if any at all. Here's Kenneth Boulding saying what I've just said, but much shorter and much more eloquent. Anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. It was either a slur on mad people or it was a slur on economists. I'm not quite sure which, but it was definitely a slur on somebody. And as I've said, economists have a lot of very clever tricks to figure out how we can go on apparently growing even on a finite world. But we have to explore those. We need to look at whether that's possible. I'm just going to show you one element of that, which is that space, that carbon space that we have. If we're to remain within the 1.5 boundary, which we probably can no longer do, and we can talk about all the consequences of that. But basically, this report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change some time ago worked out a sort of carbon budget. How much can we afford to put into the atmosphere if we want to stay within this target? And it's a distinct amount of carbon, 420 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in the numbers that they came up with. And then you ask yourself, well, what's the rate at which we're using up that capacity? And I just did this for my country, the UK, and worked out, what that would be if you took the UK as a proportion of that global population. How much would the UK's share of that 420 billion be? About 2.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And we are putting into the atmosphere, even an advanced country which has done a lot of decarbonisation, is putting into the atmosphere on a footprint basis around about 500 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. So you can do the maths. 2.5 divided by 5, 2,500 divided by 500, it's about 5 years worth of carbon. And this analysis was done back in 2018-19, so basically it accords with the idea that we've already used up our carbon budget. We've used up our carbon budget. We've used up the ecological space. We are at that frontier of the place where science tells us that we are running into ecological dangers. So that's argument one. That's argument one in relation to, can we have prosperity with growth? Because that is, the 1.5 world actually already has some quite nasty potential impacts. When we go to a 2-degree world or a 2.5-degree world or a 3-degree world, which is roughly where we're heading at the moment, the climate impacts become much more serious. And the costs of those impacts are already beginning to come home to roost. So this is not a place that speaks very much about prosperity. It doesn't even provide a very convincing case that we can continue to get economic growth out of such an economy, because that's going to be very difficult. There's no growth on a finite planet. It's become a kind of slogan, a meme. There's no jobs on a finite planet. There's no industry on a dead planet. There's no prosperity on a dead planet. And that's the simple, most straightforward argument to say that we can't have prosperity with growth. But there are other arguments, and this is where it gets really interesting. And I want to talk a little bit about actually an economic argument. So where does economic growth come from? It comes from expanding our economic activity in part, expanding the number of people that there are working, expanding the amount of capital that we employ in the economy. But economists have broadly agreed that economic growth itself has its foundations in something called labor productivity growth. Doing very, very clever things with people's time faster and faster. So that we would like if you're making, let's say, iPhones in a particular sector of the industry, that we make those iPhones faster and faster, because the faster we make them, the more we can sell, the more we sell, the more profit we have. That profit contributes to the bottom line of the economy. It creates growth. And if we can do that, if one person can create 1,000 this year, then we'd like them to create 1,500 next year and 2,000 the year after, and so on and so forth. And if you use artificial intelligence and robots and mechanization, these are things that you can use to increase labor productivity growth, and in increasing labor productivity growth, to increase economic growth, to create a bigger economy. But this is where the economic challenge comes in. This is a graph of labor productivity growth, and it's the UK, but it's similar for many Western economies, and it's even beginning to show its face in the emerging markets and in poorer economies. It's a graph that tells us the shape of labor productivity growth, which rose consistently from almost consistently, give or take a couple of world wars, between the early 1900s and about the mid-1960s. And since that time, labor productivity growth has been declining. That doesn't mean to say we don't have any labor productivity. It means the growth in that labor productivity is slowing down. And that slowdown has happened in spite of the introduction of Google, of the internet, of high technology, of mass production, and of all sorts of creative turns in the economy as well. It's a slow and gradual decline in the foundations for economic growth. So again, my question is, not so much can we have prosperity without growth, but can we have growth? Is that growth actually available? And increasingly, economists are beginning to recognize that this is a long-term process. It came to attention, this sort of slowdown in productivity, around about the time of the financial crisis. And lots of people blamed the financial crisis for the slowdown. And then, of course, it was revised. There was a new villain when it came to the pandemic. That was, a new slowdown of our productivity growth, and that led to a slowdown in our growth. But actually, this graph tells a very different story. It tells us that for 50 years, more than 50 years, we've been looking at the decline in the foundations of economic growth, that economic growth just isn't going to be there in the way that we hoped it was back in the 1960s. Back then, we could hope for 5-6% a year economic growth. Now we're lucky if we can get kind of 1-ish, and most of that actually comes from immigration rather than productivity growth. So this is a very, very different world. It's a world that conventional economics doesn't understand, if conventional economists have no economics for, because they deny the proposition that it's possible to have prosperity without growth. So they continually appeal to the dogma of economic growth and trust that somehow something will turn it all round for us, and that we'll get back the growth that has been disappearing for 50 years. That's magical thinking, in my view. So it's another reason for us to at least ask the question, can we have prosperity without growth? I want to point to one of the most iniquitous, one of the most evil aspects of the disappearance of growth, actually, because it's really important, and it speaks to the interests of some of my hosts as well, which is a kind of social challenge. This graph tells you that something has been growing. I mean, it only goes back to 1990. It doesn't go back as far as what I was looking at before. But it tells you that in the last 3 decades, something has been growing. What does that line say? It says dividends. This is the money paid out by companies on the back of the profits they earn to the shareholders of the company. That line has been growing consistently over that last 30 years. By comparison, this line here in green shows you what happened to wages. There was virtually, this is for the US, by the way, not the UK. This is the US numbers that I have here. But again, we've been doing an exercise that looks at G7 countries as a whole. You replicate very similar patterns. OECD countries is slightly different, but you still see this separation of the wages, the compensation to employees paid by companies, as opposed to the dividends paid to shareholders. And what you see is, yes, somebody's had some growth, but it wasn't the wage earners. In fact, they had stagnating wages for quite a long period of time. And then, of course, wages, dividends, what else do companies pay out from the profits they make? Sometimes, unless they live in Donald Trump's US, they get taxed on the income. What's happened to tax over that period? Have a little guess. In the US, here's the line from tax. It's actually gone down. So this is a trend which is, yes, providing growth for someone, somewhere, but actually the wages, the living conditions of ordinary people are stagnating way behind those who can claim dividends. And the money that is returned to the state in the form of taxes to provide and secure welfare for ordinary people has actually gone down in absolute terms over the last 30 years. And this would be okay if everyone was a shareholder. This would be okay if the division between owning labor, in other words, working for somebody, and owning capital, in other words, being a shareholder, was arbitrary and that anyone could do either of those things, and our income came from both of those places. But in a world in which only a few people can be shareholders or have enough wealth to be shareholders, and most people are wage earners, it's a contribution to a devastating inequality. And my next picture, and this is a quite complicated picture, I apologize for it, it comes from Thomas Piketty, the French economist, shows this picture of a almost unbelievable shift in the distribution of income. So let me just explain this picture a little bit. There's the rates of growth on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, this is what is called percentiles of the population. So the poorest percentile is on the left-hand side of my graph, and the richest percentile is on the right-hand side of the graph. And there was a post-war period, and this shows for each percentile what the rate of growth of their income was. So on the left-hand side of the graph, if you look right at the top there, you see like 6% for the bottom 1%. So the bottom 1% were increasing their income faster than the rest of the population, 6% increase per year in 1980, in the period between 1946 and 1980. So there was a post-war period in which what happened? Wealth trickled down in the way that the model suggested it was supposed to. The poorest incomes rose faster, and the richest incomes actually reduced their income slightly over a period of time. And then we had a kind of neoliberal turn in economics, which happened when right-wing governments like Reagan and Thatcher came into power in the late 1970s, early 1980s, off the back of the fuel crisis, for example, in which Keynesian economics was bashed over the head and sent out to the pasture, while a new form of neoliberal economics came in, based around the freedom of the movement of capital, the freedom of investors, and the shape of that graph changed radically, and it changed to something like this. So the blue line is the period, the post-war period, and the red line is what happened in the period between 1980-ish and the mid-2010s. And it was a complete reversal. So the big high-earning end of the income percentiles was the very, very, very rich. The top 0.001% of the population were the ones gaining the benefits, which is exactly what you would expect from the previous graph, right? The dividend holders, the shareholders, those who could command the profits from industry, they were essentially running away with income growth, while income growth was stagnating and even declining in the poorest sector of the population. So the poorest sector of the population's bottom 5 percentile actually had negative income growth over that entire period. They were not getting richer. And guess what? The services on which they might want to rely, because they didn't have income themselves, but which could have been provided by government, could no longer be provided because those companies were no longer paying taxes. It was a form of growth for a subset of the population that was systematically decimating the idea of social equality, and in the process, decimating the idea of social fabric. Now, there's lots of things wrong with what the alt-right and the far-right and what nationalism is saying about the American situation. But one of the things that actually it has got right is that even those left-leaning governments that might have done something about it presided over a situation where ordinary people, and poorer people in particular, increasingly had less, had more difficult lives, had no decent work, had no wages for decent work, and who had no support from a social security system that could no longer afford to pay because no one was paying, or the richest people were not paying enough taxes. It's a very, it's a very compelling argument when you look at the statistics. And of course, I'm sitting with someone who's made that argument very, very clearly, and one of the people who invited me is Ingrid Robbins, and that is, remains the basis for a dark place where we think about what's happened in our economy and what capitalism has become as a form of extractivism, a form of privatization of gains and socialization of losses. in which work has become a kind of low-paid servitude, in which enterprise is just a form of accumulation, in which investment is a gambling casino, the same gambling casino that led to the financial crisis and has been supported by government when the whole thing crashed, and still remains a largely speculative endeavor, and in which money is a kind of just a form of social power that is expressed through a political system that's captured by the interests. It's dystopian. This picture was actually taken in about 2011 in London during the riots through the period of austerity, when people took to the streets and burnt down this iconic building in South London. And it was a period, shortly after Prosperity Without Growth was published, when it was like watching the birds come home to roost, really, because all the writing had been on the wall for the kind of erosion of social fabric that was happening under an economic system predicated on economic growth, careless with the limits of the planet, and careless too with the lives of ordinary people on the distribution of income from the system. And that, I think, so that's the first kind of, I could leave it there, I suppose. I mean, we could stop here and then we could have some questions. But I guess I promised to answer the question, can we have prosperity without growth? All I've really shown is we can't have prosperity with growth, not that kind of growth at least. And we have not really thought about the fundamental question of what prosperity is or where we go from there. And I love this Wendell Berry quote, human and earthly limits properly understood are not confinements, but rather inducements to fullness of relationship and meaning. And I guess what he was saying, in other words, is, what should we do about it? And it is clearly so dystopian that it's an important invitation for us to do something about it. And I want to preface, so the rest really of the talk is thinking about what shall we do about it. But I want to preface that with this quote, which I used in a meeting this morning, but I apologize for using it again, but I really like, and I came across it when I was writing The Care Economy. It's from a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity by a guy called Alan Watts, a philosopher. And he basically says this: the question, what should we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. And I must say I would have loved to have had that quote to my mind when I was talking to those political advisors that we were advising, who desperately didn't want to listen to the analysis, but wanted to know, what should we do about it? What should we do on Monday? The constant refrain of the politician, what do we do on Monday? And Watts goes on to say, if a problem it can be solved at all, then to understand it and to know what to do about it are the same thing. And I guess what he's saying is that you have to get beyond the sort of obvious, there's a problem, we're living on a finite planet and there's an economy that's growing forever, to get to the underlying fabric of why these things arise and why they arise in the way they do. And that's the only way you can talk about meaningfully about what to do about something. So each of the points that I talk to next, in the next 15, 20 minutes, I guess are both a way of understanding things and, in the same token, a way of addressing the underlying problem. And the first one is actually pretty simple. Let's redefine prosperity. What actually is prosperity? How can we characterize it? And how can we use that characterization to take the problem forward? How can we understand what prosperity means? What can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? And the distinction that I want to make here, and it's a sort of a metaphorical distinction, but it's also a literal distinction, is between prosperity as wealth and prosperity as health. And it's quite a subtle shift. In English, it's just one letter. But actually, it takes you into a very different metaphorical world. Because wealth is something that you accumulate. Wealth is something which you have more and more of. Wealth is something that growth makes some sense in the pursuit of it. But health doesn't work like that. It's a state, in the WHO's word, of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It speaks a lot to what people talk about nowadays as the well-being economy. It's a sense of our own flourishing within this finite planet that we live on. And prosperity, and I'm going to come on to this, prosperity has a very different dynamic to the dynamic of prosperity as wealth. Prosperity as health doesn't operate in the same way. It doesn't simply accumulate. It doesn't respond to more and more. In fact, the only things in health that grow and grow and grow are the things that are inimical to life, like cancers. And it has no metaphorical equivalent, that idea of continual growth in nature itself. So health, this redefining prosperity of health, and it's not an arbitrary trick. It's not just a linguistic trick. I'm not making it up. Actually, when you ask people, this is a thought bubble, I can't remember what these things are called, but a kind of frequency bubble of asking people what prosperity means to them and what they see the good life, how they see the good life. And first and foremost, that idea of health comes up again and again. My own health, the health of my kids, the health of my family, the health of my parents, the health of my community, the health of my friends, and even the health of the planet. These are real concerns. I'm not saying nobody talks about income, but I am saying that without health, there is no wealth, to quote John Ruskin. It's a fundamental aspect of prosperity, and it gives us a way to understand the problem and to think about solutions. And it's also reflected in the statistical data as it happens. This is a graph of life expectancy on the vertical axis and income per capita on the horizontal axis. And what it tells you is that there is a point to income growth, that income growth matters for the poorest in society because it pretty much doubles life expectancy. When you go from having virtually nothing in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, to having around about $10,000, $15,000 per capita in Latin American economies, you pretty much double life expectancy. But then something strange happens. That increase that you might expect from having bigger and bigger incomes doesn't translate into more and more life expectancy. It doesn't translate into basic health outcomes. And you can look at this data, and it's in Prosperity Without Growth, for infant mortality, for maternal morbidity, for participation in education. You can look at it for a range of social outcomes to do with well-being. And you find this very non-linear relationship. Having more and more does not necessarily lead you towards health, towards prosperity, understood as health. So it provides us, if you like, with a way of thinking that is different from the growth-based way of thinking. And in particular, I think the metaphor is grounded in biological reality, because health in living organisms is continually about balance rather than about growth. And it happens all the time. It happens without us even thinking about it. Our existence here, our presence today, is being regulated constantly by a process called homeostasis in the physical body, which looks after our heart rate, looks after our breath, looks after our blood sugar, looks after our calcium levels, looks after pretty much everything that's going on in the body. It looks after our dopamine levels, how excited we are, constantly returning those things into balance. Not my throat, obviously, at this point in time. It needs a little bit of external intervention. But you see the point. And this idea of health as balance, and I want to give credit here to Walter Cannon, who in a book called The Wisdom of the Body, where he coined the term homeostasis, published in 1932, also in the last chapter, most of the book is just about the organism, the living organism, the processes of health, the process of homeostasis, the coming back into balance, the particular kinds of balance that we come back into. The end of the book has this really extraordinary kind of musing, experimental questioning. What if we applied this wisdom to the way that our society works? What if we could apply that sense of balance and the coming into balance to the organization of our economy? What would it mean? How would we do things differently? It's a huge, legitimate question about how to organize the economy that is very, very different, conceptually, metaphorically, dynamically different from the metaphor of constant economic growth. And so it's a really interesting way to redefine prosperity. The second question, though, and this was critical to what I was doing in Prosperity Without Growth, is to recognize that actually we're living in an economy which is a growth-based system. We've built our ideology around it, we've built our expectations around it, we've built our social values around it, we've built our industrial model around it, we've built our economic dynamics around it. We're to some extent addicted to it. We've become kind of addicted to growth, or at least let's say dependent, in very real ways. And we have to begin to understand and unpick those dependencies if we want to get to the place where we can think realistically about prosperity without growth. What does that mean? I mean, it means all sorts of things. You know, our pension system is dependent on growth. Our health care payments are dependent on growth. Our social care system is dependent on growth in all sorts of ways that are really, really uncomfortable and difficult to unpick. And yet we have to begin to unpick them if we want to get to the place where not only we understand what's going on, but also we identify the solutions to the problems. And I just want to give you a little example of that, which comes from the health dilemma, actually. You know, rapidly, health in Western economies and increasingly in emerging economies and poorer economies, chronic has changed its characteristic from infectious disease to chronic disease. Chronic disease is more or less in epidemic proportions. It absorbs 70 to 80, in some countries, higher percentage of our healthcare payments. And yet it's not the sort of thing that responds to drugs in the same way that a virus does or a bacteria. It's not something you can knock on the head with a vaccine or an antibiotic. It's a very, very different thing. Actually, a lot of it comes from our diet and the way that we live. And this was a piece of work that I did for the UK government to look at the costs of that. This is kind of real hard-nosed economic assessment of the implications of supporting an industry like the big food industry because we believe it delivers us growth, and then trying to figure out how we reduce the growth dependency of our system and still pay for healthcare. Well, this is kind of the way we can think through that, because the bottom of that graph, the blue section, is what people spend on food. It's what they spend in the shops, in the market on food. The top red sections on the left-hand side are the various costs that diet has to the UK taxpayer, to the health system, to the UK economy in terms of lost productivity, all as a result of diet-related chronic disease that is now endemic. And just for comparison, the cost on the right-hand side, the green on the right-hand side, is the cost working out what if we could pay. You know, one of the arguments is that it's all very well for rich, white, middle-class people to talk about eating healthily. Poor households can't afford to eat. And it turns out there's some truth in that, partly because of those lines on the graph I was showing you before about wages not keeping up with inflation even. But this argument sort of tells you, well, you could afford to pay them. Actually, it would be a fraction of what we're currently spending trying to fix the problems that come from having an unhealthy diet. And this is going on constantly year on year, £268 billion in the UK economy being sucked into a void, largely from the public purse. But we are still intent on promoting a food industry that's creating profits by selling us irresistible products that are undermining our health. That is a way of unpicking what I began to think of actually as the careless economy, an economy which cares nothing for health, and which actually cares more for profit than health, and privileges the pursuit of profit over the maintenance of health. But it's also an argument that you can take straight into Treasury. Yeah, you think you need all this growth to pay for healthcare. It's the growth that's making you sick. And it isn't the only growth that's making you sick. In fact, our main response to that is to spend billions of pounds on pharmaceuticals. This is a graph which shows you the growth rates on the left-hand side in blue of all those food industries that are making us sick, and in purple on the right, the growth rates, projected growth rates of the pharmaceutical companies who have some kind of pharmaceutical prescription which will treat the symptoms of the chronic disease but never address the cause. In fact, the success of those pharmaceutical industries is predicated on the fact that they will never address the symptoms of the cause of those diseases. They will only ever look at the symptoms. They will keep you, actually from birth in some cases, dependent on pharmaceutical solutions to problems that arise not from some arbitrary attack by a germ or a virus, but from something within the system itself that is promoting a dysfunctional food system that's consistently making us sick. And the only response to it is a pharmaceutical intervention, which is always acts essentially as a poison within the body. That's what pharmaceutical interventions are. Sometimes they're very useful, I don't deny them, and I certainly have used them myself and will definitely use them in the future. But actually, when you argue that the route to the solution to an undermining of health from a dysfunctional food system, which is creating masses of growth for the profit holders, the profit takers, the dividends, but is delivering ill health and only being able to be offset by these wonderful growth rates in the pharmaceutical industry. The one on the right-hand side, in case you can't see the writing, is anti-obesity drugs. And the growth rates in those industries are, they create stars in the eyes of politicians. I've watched Keir Starmer in the UK, you've probably seen politicians do the same thing. Basically, delighted at a memorandum of understanding with a pharmaceutical company which is coming into the country to invest billions, it says millions of pounds, billions of pounds, in providing anti-obesity drugs, which are in themselves, again, a pharmaceutical intervention which will destroy the integrity of the body's own ability to cure itself if you can only get the conditions right. But we can't get the conditions right because they are embedded in growth-based systems, and we can't give up growth because growth is what gives us the taxes that will give us the income to create the health system that we can improve all those problems by spending on pharmaceutical companies. It's a kind of it's a narrative, it's a set of interrelated misunderstandings of the problem, which if we could only untangle and unthread and say, actually, ideologically, this was a mistake, then we could begin to make some progress and we could reduce our growth dependency. I want to talk about one more growth dependency, which is our increasing dependency on warfare rather than welfare. And here, my contrast is between the really quite small amount of money that the EU, for example, committed to health in the wake of the pandemic, around about £5 billion over a period of 6 years between 2021 and 2027, and the 800 billion that it's committed to rearming the EU, because it has created an insecure world in which it has listened to an arms lobby, which has said the only way to replace this security is to invest in arms at rates that dwarf the rate at which we're prepared to invest in health, in our own security, in the genuine security. And the bottom figure is even more staggering, that the US has spent $8 trillion prosecuting wars in one way or another since 9/11. The amounts of money that it's possible to dedicate, that it's possible to persuade the state to dedicate towards arms, by comparison with the amounts of money that it's possible to persuade the state to dedicate to basic notions of preventive health that would allow us security, would allow us prosperity, that would allow us a decent quality of life, is absolutely staggering. And yet all of it, really, with a little bit of thought, a little bit of design, is perfectly possible. You could design systems which were not growth dependent. You could design systems which were less growth dependent. You could design systems which put health rather than wealth first. That's my point. Reverse inequality sort of stands to reason, really. This is a quote from Ingrid. A world that accepted that the sky is not the limit, that there is only so much any one person should have, would be a world transformed. It comes from her book on limitarianism. And it is absolutely essential to finding any kind of prosperity, not just for those who are the poorest in society, but because, as many analysts have showed us, in societies with greater inequality, everybody suffers. And those societies begin to dissolve the social fabric, they begin to lose trust in institutions, they begin to lead to this sort of paradoxical, horrible picture, really, of a homeless person sleeping under a fashion poster while people walk by. You begin to undermine social fabric by not tackling these questions. What could we do? I just want to show you that these things are not intractable. I mean, Ingrid's solution has been some sort of upper limit on wealth, but she accepts also that that's one of many measures to reduce the inequality in society. And my colleague Peter Victor and I wanted to look at these measures and say, you know, how far could you go, even in a post-growth society? Because one of the points that Thomas Piketty has made is that as the growth rate declines, the question of distribution becomes much more difficult. You've got a fixed pie. You have to think about redistribution. If you can just grow the pie, then everyone can be better off. But if you've got a fixed pie or a declining pie, you have to think about redistribution. And there are various ways of doing that. You can think about a graduated income tax. You can think about wealth taxes. People have begun to talk about that finally. You can talk about some form of basic income to support a social floor. You can think about, as Yanis Varoufakis has done, a social dividend from taxing actually the basis of profit-making institutions as a form of common equity that's then used to fund a basic income. There's lots of things, and you can do all of the above. And what we wanted to do was to test in what kind of economic society these things might work. So what I'm going to show you a quite complicated graph. You can skip over it if it's too much at this point in the evening. But basically, we tested two kinds of society. One was a kind of hyper-capitalism, a capitalism driven by the tech bros, where technological innovation was everything, where the interest of capital was protected in society, where you could invest aggressively and get rid of labor because it's a cost, and in which you had a very high, what economists call an elasticity of substitution between income, between labor and capital. That means, you know, if you invest enough in these technologies, you get rid of people and you replace them with capital. And it's easy to do. On the other hand, we could think of a society which protected the rights of labor. I've called this proto-socialism. Now, socialism is a difficult word, but proto-socialism, in a sense, is a kind of forerunner of socialism which recognizes the importance of labor, of the meaning of work in society, not just in terms of its ability to contribute to the economy, but actually as a way of us participating in society, of giving us a role in society and a role that matters because it creates and maintains a social fabric. So this, all you need to take from the graph essentially, and this is published in a paper, the reference is there, is that the red lines all correspond to hypercapitalism, and this is a graph, an indexed graph of inequality. They all start in the same place because that's where we set the index. And we said what happens over time with this progressive income taxes, wealth taxes, basic incomes, the social dividend, whatever Yanis was calling it, all of the red lines, even some of them come down initially, they begin to rise exponentially as the growth rate declines, which is just what Piketty was worried about. But then we looked at the proto-social aspect, defense of labor, reducing the elasticity between income, between labor and capital, and creating rights to work, rights to labor. And we found a very different situation. Every single one of the green lines falls. It's possible to reduce inequality in a post-growth society if you have the right institutional architecture, if you have the design of the system correct. And you know, these are not, there's a lot of hand-waving around, you know, fluffy visions of utopia. This is not where we are. Where we are is we need solutions which are grounded in economic understanding, grounded in a recognition of the problems, but also in an understanding of the architecture of those problems, and an openness to solutions to those problems. Once we face the reality of a declining growth rate, we have to have an economics to deal with what I call a post-growth society. And that's really the fourth element, rethink economics. I'm running out of time a little bit, as well as voice. So I'm going to very quickly just summarize some of how do we get from here to a different place. And to some extent, it's about rethinking. So work, you know, as I've said, is an element of prosperity. How about we think of work as a participation in the life of society? Investment, which was a form of speculation in the dysfunctional extractivism model, actually is the most fundamental commitment that we have to the future. That's what investment is. It's putting aside some of our resources now in order to be able to protect the interests of the future. And yet we've lost sight of that idea, that philosophical idea of what investment is. Money, it sort of was a form of power, but actually, what if we think of money as the ultimate way in which government can ensure the social good? Reclaim the power of money for people and for government. And enterprise ultimately is a form of service rather than a form of accumulation of profit. All of these things are laid out in some detail in Prosperity Without Growth, in the subsequent book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, and a little bit in the care economy as well. And I want to, again, just point out that this is not a trivial or frivolous territory. It's a place where we begin to ask and find new questions about the structure of the economy. What kind of economy is it? Here's the architecture of our economy drawn as a map of the carbon intensity of our different sectors and the labor intensity of our different sectors. And there's a really interesting point that comes out here, that the sectors that you want in society that contribute to health, things like healthcare itself, social care, education, the public administration of government, arts and recreations, things that contribute to physiological and psychological health, have two distinct characteristics. They're lower in carbon intensity, so that's good for climate change, and they're higher in employment intensity. This is an economy in which you could employ people if you could get the conditions right, and that's one of the ways that I characterize what I call the care economy. And I want to just come round just in the final moments to the care economy, because it's the way that I've begun to think about the question of what would it look like if we got there. And it starts with prosperity as health. And of course, if you start with prosperity as health, it makes a lot of sense to think about economy as care rather than growth. But you actually have to think a little bit carefully about what care is, because care can be misused as a word. It can be used as sort of claim to the moral high ground, all the things we care about, and therefore we are good people, or all the things we care about, and therefore they should be given special preferences. We actually have to ask questions about what care is in a model defined, in which prosperity is defined as health. And I like this definition of Berenice Fisher and Joan Tronto, which she says that care, it's everything we do basically to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That makes a lot of sense. But it's still a sort of a question about, how do we defend care itself? How do we restore care to this central place in the organization of an economy which provides prosperity without growth? And I want there just to end on a little story, I guess. I'm in the middle of writing the care economy. I'm sitting on a beach in Wales, and I'm watching the moon rise above the ocean. And into my head pops this question: does the moon care? And at first I think to myself, wow, I've been working on this book too long, my head's fried. What can that possibly mean? And then I think to myself, well, if the moon could care, if it could be said to care, then in what sense could it be said to care? And the first thing that comes to mind is the moon's constant attention. It's constantly there. Care is something that demands attention, because it demands that sense of where health lies, attention to where health lies, attention to the direction of travel to get to health. It's also something that keeps many things in balance. I mean, the moon keeps the tides in balance, for example. That's pretty well known. The tides go in, they come out, they do it with a regularity that's absolutely predictable. They do that because of the moon. And also because the moon was there doing that to the tides, it allowed a small space between the ocean and the land in which our ancestors crawled out of the ocean and started walking on 2 feet. Without the moon, we wouldn't be here. In fact, without the moon, we wouldn't be here in another sense, because the moon keeps planet Earth at a very distinct 23-degree angle in its orbit around the sun that gives us a temperate climate that's rapidly being destroyed by climate change. But at least the moon is doing its bit. It's caring. in some sense. It's bringing us back into balance. And that became for me a sort of sudden realization that care is not just a moral high ground word. It's not a particular sector of the economy. It's not even a kind of, far-flung vision of a post-growth economy sitting on a graph. Care is a fundamental organizing principle for organic life. Without it, we are nothing. The careless economy that's deliberately undermining health is actually the antithesis of what we should be aiming for in an economy which brings us constantly back into the balance of health through this process of a restoration, if you like. All the vital mechanisms. This is Claude Bernard, a physiologist in 1878. However varied they may be, always have one purpose, that of maintaining the integrity of the conditions of life within our bodies, within the internal environment, within the organism, and indeed, possibly, if Walter Cannon is to be followed, within society itself. Care, in other words, gives us back something which we can use as a principle to talk about how we organize our economies, and a specific principle which is around this restorative power that brings us back into balance, into health. And it is therefore the most fundamental investment that an economy and a government can make. And it's also an unpaid debt, a debt that the careless economy owes to the care economy. And that provides the answer to the question that's continually raised. Yeah, fine, how are you going to pay for it? Actually, that's the wrong way round entirely. You could make the case, you can't afford your healthcare because you're too busy building rockets to go to Mars, or because you're too busy building AI technologies to sell social media to your kids and target them with algorithms which are going to destroy their mental health as they destroy their physical health. And you can do all of these things in the name of an economic growth that you hope will come from big tech, big food, big pharma, and the arms industry. And in the process, you can then watch your society disintegrate and go as far away from health as you can possibly get. Or you can turn the question on its head. The care economy is the foundation for everything else. Without the care economy, there is no other economy. The careless economy is a parasite on the care economy. It's not about the careless economy having to find enough money to pay for care. It's about us getting priorities right to understand that without the care economy, there is nothing else. There is no prosperity. Prosperity is health, the economy is care. That is basically the proposition and the journey between prosperity without growth and my most recent book, The Care Economy. And it's my answer to that question. Ultimately, can we have prosperity without growth? The answer to that question, I believe, hangs in the balance, and it hangs in the balance of our political will to make the changes needed to create a society in which health becomes the governing metaphor and in which care is the mechanism through which we achieve it. Thank you very much. Was it too long?
Tim, thank you so much for your inspiring and also touching talk. Now we will welcome another guest on our stage who will give a short reflection on what we've just heard. She is a postdoctoral researcher, also working on the project Visions for the Future here at Utrecht University. She is teaching the Ethics of Institutions course together with Ingrid Robijns. And she wrote a dissertation on the unconditional basic income, also very interesting. Please, a very warm applause for Catarina das Neves.
So hi everyone. I feel very humbled to share the stage with Tim Jackson. Oh, that's okay. And also an immense joy to see how many of you are here today. This is quite intimidating. So before we have the pleasure of hearing all of your questions, I guess you might have a lot of questions for Tim Jackson. I just wanted to maybe make some reflections, maybe share some questions that can open up the discussion for all of us. So let me start by saying that most of us here know that there's a number of lessons that Tim has shared with us and has taught us over the years, but there are two specific ones from his recent work that I would like to highlight. So the first one is that his move from prosperity as wealth to prosperity as health, I think vividly shows us what is wrong with the current system that we have, a system that is committed and is addicted to economic growth. So it tells us also that we basically lost sight of what matters and we are stuck on a very pervasive loop. We are working jobs to buy things that not necessarily make us happy, jobs that stress us, and also in the process of doing so, we are compromising our health to a significant degree, all while we are destroying the planet that we require to live. The second point is that Tim's invitation to reconsider prosperity as health, I think, has a very strong motivational bite. So establishing care as a foundational principle for the economy, as this restorative force that can gets us into balance, I think tells us something that whatever we need to do to overcome the ecological crisis that we are living goes beyond what are the traditional arguments many of us are familiar with. So it's not only about caring for nature, it's not only about caring for other sentient beings, it's not only about caring for those who are far away and already suffering the consequences of climate disasters. Think about over the summer, the people suffering huge floodings in India or the deadly wildfires in the Iberian Peninsula. It's also not only about caring for those who are yet to be born and who unfortunately might be set to inherit a very inhospitable planet. All of these are very strong moral reasons to be motivated to care for the environment today. But Tim has showed us that there's something else. This pursuit of economic growth is harming our ability to live a healthy life, even in places where affluence is a reality. So the pursuit of economic growth is compromising our ability to be healthy, given the jobs that we need to do, what we drink, what we eat, the air that we are breathing. So I think it will not be a surprise that I share and I'm on the same side as Tim is, but I would like to raise some 3 points which cluster around different questions, which I think showed us that this is not a path without challenges, and I hope that it can broaden the discussion that we will have in the remainder part of this evening. So the first point is about the prosperity question. Are we talking about feeling good or are we talking about living well? So the notion of prosperity as health, advanced by Tim Jackson, resembles a lot of philosophical accounts of well-being. And indeed, in the book, well-being and health are often discussed on a par. Now, there is objective accounts of well-being. Those are those that hold that certain things are valuable for us. They are important regardless of whether we see their value, we desire them, or prefer them. But then there's also subjective accounts of well-being. Those are the ones who are grounded on the satisfaction of individual preferences. Now, I think it's essential to be clear on whatever conception of well-being that we are talking about for a number of reasons. So the first is that this helps us to identify which institutions, which provisioning systems we need to establish to ensure that everyone meets the threshold of well-being that we endorse. The second is because in the context of ecological limits, an objective account of well-being is perhaps better at determining but also justifying whatever we are all entitled to, but also what we might need to give away to be able to stay within ecological limits. Third, because we need to understand the challenges we face in reshaping society. Under capitalism, well-being has been framed as having many options and being free to choose whatever option we would like. So to move towards a new, radical conception of prosperity implies a change in how we see what's valuable in life. It's a shift on how we perceive our success, how we compare to each other, how we believe that our life plans might be worthwhile or not. And this is not impossible to do. In the past, we have changed our social norms, we have changed our cultural frameworks. But it raises, I think, very important challenges. For instance, if we struggle to perceive that our well-being is not constituted by the satisfaction of individual preferences, but instead it is by the fulfillment of certain objective needs, will we be likely and willing to support policies that secure the latter, that secure our needs, while possibly restricting our choices? And it's worth remembering that this is not only about some of us rejecting this change. It's also about the fact that there's a lot of constraints on individual choices, as Tim has pointed out when discussing the pharmaceutical or the food industry. In many instances, policies where governments are going to heavily regulate some industries or subsidize the consumption of wholesome foods might be the best alternative that we have. But for that to happen, we need to strategize. We need to know how we can get people to rally around this new radical conception of prosperity. Finally, I think clarity also is very important so that we are on the lookout to undesirable, or maybe, undesirable impacts, but also strong normative tensions. For instance, when determining what we perceived as valuable, can we try to avoid being condescending or intolerant of certain lifestyles? As Tim Jackson reminds us in his recent book, The Care Economy, a lot of conceptions of the good life might be compromising our symbolic and physical health, to the point that they can be self-destructive. So if we are going to move towards maybe abolish them or restricting them to a significant degree, does this raise issues about paternalism? Can we ensure that what is seen as a life worth living is plural enough to accommodate some of our differences, like differences in culture? So this is my first point. The second point is related with the discussion on work and productivity, but also whether we want more meaningful work or we want to get rid of labor to a significant degree. So Tim Jackson points out that in the quest for labor productivity, the market selects in the fast-paced economy, which is often very carbon intensive, and selects out the slow economy, like the care economy, which is labor intensive, it's low in carbon intensity, and also importantly, helps secure our needs. And in the Care Economy book, which you all should read if you haven't yet, Tim also talks about Hannah Arendt and the distinction between labor, what we do to tend to our needs, and work, which is the activities that we do to try to achieve permanence, to deal with our existential anxiety. So I take it that Tim Jackson sees labor and work both as very central, but also that we should restructure the economy around valuing, but also predominantly being made of activities that are activities that secure our needs, that are low in carbon. So the principles of the care economy, of labor as conceived in the Arendtian sense. Thus, caring for others, encouraging crafts when it comes to manufacturing goods, or focusing on perhaps low-intensive, localized forms of agriculture should be the activities that we would invest in. And in many of these works, Tim Jackson also talks about the state as a lever to encourage some of these activities, for instance, through large-scale programs of public jobs, like proposals for a job guarantee. But I would like to raise two, perhaps, concerns. So the first one is about the feasibility of this proposal. So even if we focus solely on securing and supplying basic needs, I struggle to see whether we will be able to do this, according to the principles of care as labor, to the scale that we require, so that everyone has access to the basic needs that they need. So the slow economy activities, I think, should be encouraged and promoted, right? Think about community gardens, think about repair shops. Those are all very important. But the extent of the global population seems to require a level of production that might demand that we pursue some productivity gains to a significant degree, so that we pursue some principles of the fast economy. Think about securing housing, food, some manufactured goods like clothes for everyone in the world. This should, of course, be done at the lowest level possible of carbon and material use. But even that might require that we pursue some efficiency, or efficiency to a significant degree. So the principles of care might be possible and desirable in some activities, like taking care of the elderly, of the dependent, of children, but maybe not for all the activities that we require to secure our needs. So I guess the question that I would like to pose is whether we can have a transition that avoids being detrimental to the worst off, and when I mean worst off globally. The second point is whether, not so much if this is feasible, because I'm also not an economist, and Tim Jackson will know that much better than me, but it's whether this is desirable. So the proposal of securing our needs to the principles of care as labor seems wonderful. Imagining finding meaningfulness and finding it enjoyable to build your own furniture or grow your own tomatoes all the time. But I'm not certain that if we had to do this every day to secure our individual needs, but also importantly, the needs of others, we will find this enjoyable, or I'm not certain that everyone would feel the same about it. Even when it comes to tending to others with care in the traditional sense that oftentimes we talk about, those who have done it can attest that taking care of a dependent person 24/7 can be a quite burdensome activity. So with all of these, I mean to ask whether we might be romanticizing what securing needs and care actually is, but also whether centering our lives around labor is the goal we should be pursuing, especially because there are competing proposals that could accomplish some of the values that I think Tim Jackson and many of us endorse, like ecological sustainability, while having a different take on the centrality of labor. For instance, in the Farewell to the Working Class, André Gorz showed some skepticism on the potentialities of a craft-like, more local economy. He proposed that we should work to reduce the share of labor-intensive work in the subsistence economy through technology combined with reduced consumption. In effect, he was trying to propose that we should invest to free us as much as possible from labor, and the residual labor that he believed would remain should be redistributed fairly, but always trying to keep this residual share to the lowest possible level. So I'm certain that in some activities, this sort of technological fix or automation will not be desirable, again, thinking about the activities of tending to others, but in many other sectors which are crucial to prosperity as health, they are crucial to securing our needs, I'm not sure whether André Gorz's proposal is not desirable. So this raises the question of whether we should be committed to a life where labor is central, because I think for many post-growthers the answer would be no. Namely those who have visions of society where we should try to reduce the share of needs, of tending to needs in our life, and perhaps dedicate ourselves to leisure or to even work in the Arendtian sense. So I'm thinking about proposals like a basic income, no surprise, instead of a job guarantee that could accomplish this alongside other measures. So I'm sort of trying to question whether in the post-growth transition on the economy of care, what sort of role do we see for labor and for work, and what reasons lie behind the choices that we have? Because it might be reasons related with meaningfulness, or they might be related with concerns with redistribution, like some of the things that you mentioned, Tim. But I guess the important point is that a lot of competing proposals that don't see labor as central can also ensure some of these values, and particularly even they can ensure redistribution, because a job guarantee can for sure ensure redistribution of income, but so can a basic income. And now, to close, I move to my third point, which is the transition challenge. Namely, how can we get rid of a system that we are all trapped in? And I think it's a very well thought out point to mention that any discussion on what we have to do is meaningless if we don't diagnose the problem. But when it comes to most problems, including post-growth, we have many solutions that would be effective perhaps in addressing the problem. And the reasons why we choose one over the other might be related with how effective they are at tackling the problem we are discussing, but many other values too. Conceptions on justice, equality, freedom, democracy, or efficiency. It's also about who do we see as spearheading the transition. So in Post-Growth, another of Tim Jackson's books, he talks about using the state as a lever, as something that could help us overcome our cravings for more, enabling us to find new pathways of prosperity. And I'm very sympathetic to this view, but I guess given the nature of the ecological limits that we are facing, the growth dependencies that we heard about, but also the very time-sensitive nature of the challenge that we are currently in, an enabler state might not be enough. But then we need to discuss what limits are we going to impose to a state that acts as an enforcer, and this is a very riddled and complicated discussion. So the project we envision, I mean to say, is value-laden as much as are the proposals that comprise it. And neither choice is neutral, and so should escape our discussion. I'm going to close by saying that this is not merely a debate on the realm of ideas. We desperately need grand societal visions, and over the years, Tim is offering us that very intelligently, I think. But we also need strategizing. We need to consider where to start and why. We need to know how we're going to encourage people to rally around our vision for the future. And doing so, I think, requires proposals that are tangible enough to resonate and to be relatable with the challenges that people are facing in their day-to-day. And some of the proposals that Tim mentioned offer clues, but I would urge us to also consider where should we start? Should we start with the food industry? Should we start with the pharmaceutical industry? With tackling wealth inequality? What should we be prioritizing amongst this menu of proposals that we have? We can pursue many things, and we should all be pursuing many things at the same time. But it's also worth realizing that resources are limited, but importantly also that reactionary forces use catchy, straightforward messages that resonate, even if, unfortunately, they are often grounded on lies. So I think the call is, let's look for visions that are aspirational, but they are also action-guiding, and that we can translate them in tangible proposals so that we can start, well, we are now here also, but we can continue to fight for social and ecological justice today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your reflection. I bet people in the audience are burning with questions. Tim, would you like to come back to the stage so that people can ask you questions? And if you have a question for Catarina, that's also fine, then she can answer as well. Who wants to start? Yes, all in the back. I'm coming to you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Jos, I'm a PhD candidate here. I was wondering, in your vision of a care economy, how much space there would be for these features that we typically see as sort of central to capitalism. So competition, exchange, and production through markets, the pursuit of profits. Like, how much space would there be for this, or is it really sort of like a complete overhaul of everything, basically?
Yeah, thank you. That allows me also a chance to say something to at least one of Catarina's points. To some extent, and this comes partly from my lens of health as a place of balance and care as a restorative force, I think it's really important to apply those principles to how we think about the change that's needed as well. So to Catarina's point, for example, about, is it more work or less work? Is it more labor or less labor? Is it more productivity or less productivity? I think it's reasonable to accept, as André Gortz does, that there are places where productivity improves the quality of our lives. That's fairly obvious in some basic ways. And yet there are other places where that pursuit of productivity undermines the quality of what's being done. So, when it comes to washing your sheets by hand, the washing machine has become a way of liberating ourselves from meaningless tasks, or mixing concrete with a spade. For anyone who's tried to do it for very long, you don't get very far without wearing yourself out. There are some kinds of tasks that are helped by technology. I think it's not an argument that it's throwing away technology. And it's not an argument that's entirely throwing away the idea of a market economy either. It is rather, to an appreciable extent, a rebalancing of the power that the market and competition has had in framing our lives and framing our society and framing the way we think about the economy, and the sense in which it has overridden values which are equally important when you look at them in nature, like health and the restoration of balance and the cooperation rather than competition, and symbiosis rather than the survival of the fittest. We adopted a set of metaphors, and there are some sociologists who argue actually that the adoption went the other way around, that the Darwinian revolution, which kind of gave us the centrality of the competition between species and the struggle for survival, that actually that metaphor was borrowed from an early capitalism in which those values were prevalent. And that's why the science that we developed around evolution saw first those competitive struggles for existence on which Darwinian selection operates. And then capitalism took one look at Darwinian theory and said, yeah, that's natural, so that's what we should be doing in capitalism. And that adoption of a kind of circularity of a set of metaphors was overturned, interestingly, by a particular, I suppose, in evolutionary theory, by a woman called Lynn Margulis, and said, hang on a minute, this is a masculine, testosterone-driven capitalistic science and a way of looking at the world that misses that actually more than a half of what's going on is about symbiosis and cooperation and reciprocity. And so my argument, if I follow my logic of, this is about balance, says that both of those forces exist in nature, both of those forces can be productive in the long run in society, but when they become unbalanced, that's the point at which we run into the problems that we're running into.
Thank you. There are also trickling down some questions on my phone from the live chat. And someone was very early in the evening already. He was asking, or she, what if we introduce a progressive tax on consumption and decrease the tax on labor? Would that solve the ecological crisis? Yeah, it would be a step in the right direction. I mean, that proposal of a sort of ecological tax reform, of a tax on the bads instead of the goods, has been on, it's so ultimately sensible that it has to make sense. Unfortunately, we're all, have lived in governments where the trend has been in the opposite direction. And taxing on labour is a very easy thing to do because labour is relatively powerless in society. And taxes which are on materials or on wealth are very difficult to implement because wealth has an undue impact on the process of government. But in theory, that question is absolutely to the good, and we should be using taxes, in part, of course, to raise revenues, but in part, of course, to incentivize the things that we want or don't want in society. And if we see labour, and I'm afraid I do, to some extent, still see labour as a good thing, not just for the outcome of labour, but actually for the process of participating in society, then labour is a good. And so to tax labour as employee taxes do, insurance contributions on labour, is a mistake. When it makes it more difficult to employ people. We're seeing that in the country at the moment. In my country, the Chancellor, one of the first things she did was to introduce an increase in the national insurance contribution, which is a tax on labour. And now we have businesses that employ ordinary people to do decent jobs going out of business because they can no longer afford to employ people. It goes in exactly the wrong direction. Ernst von Weizsäcker pointed this out, I think 30, 40 years ago in a book on ecological tax reform, and I think the work is still valid. Tax the bads, not the goods. Yeah. Thank you. I'll go front, yeah.
I was wondering if you could reflect on the reflection, the third point, on how to transition and how to strategize. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to avoid that being a what to do on Monday question, but and to some extent I kind of feel as though the space is bigger than Catarina's kind of giving it credit for. If you have the ideological will to do something on Monday, it's quite clear that there are a number of things we should be doing. And it's also, I mean, to me, this is about the organization of society and the organization of the contribution of people in society. I want to give you a kind of parallel example, which might seem a little bit odd to start with, but I want to bring it back home if I can try. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, I traveled quite a lot because the book coincided with just the aftermath of the prosperity without growth, coincided with the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I traveled quite a lot, particularly in Southern Europe. In Southern Europe at that time, rates of unemployment and youth unemployment particularly was skyrocketing. They were like 50, 60% youth unemployment. Absolutely extraordinary. And the economies were struggling, and they were struggling under a kind of austerity response that came in on the back of the financial crisis. And yet when you visited those places, you looked around and at the fabric of society, at the healthcare system, at the crumbling education system, at the crumbling buildings, which could have been renovated and repaired. And you ask yourself the question, hang on a minute, is there no demand for labor in this society? There was a demand for labor, but there was no mechanism within the construction of the economy to supply that labor. It was a profound economic mismatch in which actually you had lots of people out of work and lots of things to do, but no system to put them together. And I guess that's what I feel about the answer to Catarina's question, is that in the right circumstances, with the right motivation, we have enormous ingenuity to solve enormous problems. And actually that ingenuity has just been augmented by the arrival of things like ChatGPT. Thank you very much. If you use that as a sort of aid to the solution of problems, you can engage in relatively large-scale, wide changes across a wide range of problem areas. Food, pharmaceuticals, the regulation of industries, the reform of the financial industry, the reform of work, the training of people to do jobs that need to be done in society. And you can do this if you have political will, in ways that we have not yet mobilized. In part because of sclerotic bureaucratic systems, in part because of a lack of ideological will, in part because of a lack of a destination. So I see that issue of, yes, we've got limited resources and we can't achieve everything, so we've got to prioritize, and until we've prioritized, we better not do anything. I'm caricaturing what you said, Catarina, but I sympathize with where it's coming from. But I think actually our ability, our ingenuity, our imagination, our vision, in the right circumstances, can be employed to solve those problems in ways that we have not yet even, in some minute proportion, begun to tap. And I think that potential is huge.
Thanks, yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for making economics not dismal. My question is a bit deviating, but in your book, Post-Growth, you mentioned about how in human nature, as much as or even more than competition, we have intrinsic natures for collaboration. Well, that goes way back to symbiosis, as well as prudence, and how maybe through these methods that you mentioned today, it can be cultivated within, say, economic systems, individual systems. My concern would be how far that empathy, collaboration, and prudence can travel, especially as societies, we expand from the concept of individuals, groups, countries, and especially in interstate dynamics, where partly because the narrative of addiction to competition that you mentioned, there seems to be a lack of collaboration, but it also seems to be that the nature of the current way states are organized fundamentally restricts how much collaboration they can have, and maybe the maximum we can go is the failure of the UN and what Trump did. So if you were to reorganize the structure of states today, how would it look like from scratch if we were to allow collaboration?
It's a really interesting question. It reminds me, there's a paper by a sociologist called Gumplowitz, which was written in the middle of the 19th century, that basically took the concept of sustainability, before sustainability had even been invented, and says it's impossible because of this interstate competition that you talk about would ultimately lead to a competition for resources that would in itself then lead to conflict, and that would ultimately lead only to aggression. And I mean, his vision actually was even probably bleaker than the one that you're pitching, because he was saying that's going to happen irrespective of how you organize society. I want to answer your question a little bit in two different ways. Are there other ways of organizing society than nation states? Yes, undoubtedly. But it is also true, and there's some basic psychology and neuropsychology that says it, that people group together, they flock, human beings flock, and they affiliate with people with like characteristics, and they disaffiliate with people with opposite characteristics, and sometimes that brings people into conflict. So it seems to me that, yes, we can think about different organizations than the nation state, and to some extent the EU was an experiment in that. And we should continue to think about those possibilities. But we should also think about basic strategies under any organization of the nation state which lead us away from that propensity for conflict. And those, I think, are the strategies that I'm trying to appeal to, partly through that work, as you said, in post-growth, where I talked about the importance of collaboration, but actually also in the care economy, because it seems to me that if you apply the principle of care to the relationship between states, you don't reach for the security of the arms industry to defend your interests. You reach for the relationship between yourself and the other, between states. I mean, this was a point made absolutely beautifully by a Buddhist monk called Thich Nhat Hanh, who was born in the middle of Vietnam, in the middle of the Vietnam conflict, and came to the US to talk about the relationship between states, and was exiled from the US because of his anti-war views, essentially, and ended up creating a wonderful collaborative village in the south of France called Plum Village, a sort of monastic retreat for people with a lot of ecological views. But his point was, this idea that the nation state is your home, and you defend your home against all comers, and you see everybody around you as enemies, leads within us automatically to a position of conflict and aggression. And that's being played out in our media, in our political rhetoric, in our relationships with other states, in ways which are just mindless at the moment. So my kind of appeal there is, yes, let's think differently about the nation state, but let's think about the basic human relationships between people as the basis for relationships between nation states, and that gives us at least more space to think about diplomacy rather than warfare. And that to me is a kind of, again, a sort of an appeal to the idea that warfare is a destabilizing force. It takes us away from balance. Diplomacy is a stabilizing force. It builds relationship. It brings us back into balance. And ultimately, one direction leads to destruction, the other leads to health.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say, but we're running out of time. I already see some people leave. Maybe people need to catch their trains and stuff. Is there someone with a question that is short and it's very suitable to be the last question? Yeah, I see someone here. Yes?
Yes, hello. My question is related to the relationship between health and wealth, particularly in relation to reversing inequality. I once had quite a capitalist enthusiastic teacher who told that if we would perfectly redistribute all wealth on the world, that we would still not have enough to let everyone flourish. So I guess I would be asking his question then, do you think if we end up with this fixed pie, is there enough for everybody to live healthily, wealthily, and flourish?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously hadn't heard of Mahatma Gandhi, and there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed, which I think sort of was a kind of answer to that particular professor. But it does have a legitimate. It does have a legitimate basis, that question. There are some sort of structural issues there. Can we feed people? Can we feed people decent food? And actually, when I've looked at some of this at the local level, at the country basis, it turns out that not many Western countries can actually feed their population decent food by growing that food domestically. We've become reliant on those international markets, and those international markets have produced, mass-produced, engineered calories, which are part of what's making us sick. That's not decent food. It's not a decent food system. And creating that decent food system is a real logistical challenge. It is about reclaiming the possibilities for both local produce and imported produce of a high quality that supports health. And I'm not suggesting that's trivial. It's not trivial, but most of the evidence suggests that if you organize that food system effectively for need rather than greed, then you get a lot closer to that possibilities of feeding the world. But then there's a point at which you have to ask, and I think this is probably another thing that your professor was kind of hinting at, is that, you know, ultimately, are there some kinds of material limits? Are there some places where we hit the buffers, where actually we can't do certain things? At least only a few people can do them, because if we tried to extend it to everybody, then there just wouldn't be enough to go around. And I think there, and we haven't had much time to talk about it, but Catarina alluded to it, there is a really important conversation about what it is that is limited and what it is that is limitless. And certain things, materials, energy, the finite planet, the lifespan of a human being, all of these things create certain kinds of limits. But there are also things which are not limited despite those material limits: our ingenuity, our creativity, our vision, our sense of empathy, our relationship with other people, our sense of the possibilities of the future for our world, our aspirations for prosperity. We know that those things are kind of unlimited. And in some sense, the task is to move from a consumerism which promises heaven but is based on limited resources and can never be really accessible to 8, 9, 10 billion people in the world, towards a vision for prosperity that is about a genuine sense of flourishing within those things that are unlimited. And as I put it in post-growth, is that the limited, actually, we can think of limits as a horrendous constraint on all our freedoms, something to be balked at or overcome at all costs. Or we can think of limits as actually a learning tool, as a teacher, as the gateway to the limitless. And if we begin to think in that way, then we open out vistas that go beyond consumerism and ideas for a prosperity that goes beyond material prosperity and allows us to become, I would argue, more fully human rather than less so, because we have distinguished between what glitters and what matters and what's limited and what's limitless. And it's in that limitless terrain, actually, that I think the biggest horizons for human progress live.
Thank you. I think that is a beautiful way to end this talk. Thank you so much. I think next time when we invite you, we'll plan an hour extra to make sure that we can discuss more. A warm applause for Tim Jackson and Catarina Moiteiro.
Thank you.
Thank you. You can have a seat. Just a few points from my side. Don't forget about our Bedwaiter Festival. Also, if you're not a Dutch speaker, we have a lot of English program stuff, so get your tickets before it's too late. Also, but this is only for Dutch-speaking students that might be in the room, we are organizing a Studium Generale Academy, and we still have some spots available. So if you're interested in learning how to make a program like this, send us an email, and we'll let you know when we start and if you can still join. So that's our... And the last one, we would really like to know your thoughts on what you think of this evening. So if you have a little time for extra care for us, please fill in our questionnaire. It's very short, and then there's also room to leave some feedback or remarks or anything that's on your mind about tonight. So thanks a lot for that in advance. And I want to close it off with maybe the remark, if you ever are gazing at the moon, remember that the moon also may already be a part of the care economy. Thank you very much.